name is Manuel Roman Lacayo. I am the acting director for the Center for Latin American Studies. And it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to the first of what we hope in a long-standing series on crimes against humanity in Latin America. Not that we want to perpetrate them, but actually we want to look at crimes against humanity in Latin America from different angles with looking at the issues and topics that may be relevant and focusing on different countries or multiple countries over time. We also have as our guest today, our presenter, Sebastian Cuellar, who is assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at the Universidad Nacional de Colombia. He is also a Pitt doctoral student, and his research interests focus on political violence, human rights, social movements, and collaborative sociology. So without further ado, I will leave you with Sebastian.
Manuel, thank you very much for inviting me to this wonderful event of class. As Manuel mentioned, I am finishing my dissertation in the Department of Sociology of the University of Pittsburgh. I have been working hand by hand and walking along with victims of political violence. I've been working in an organization that is called the Nidia Erika Foundation Organization for Human Rights that specializes in supporting and representing victims of enforced disappearance. So basically what I am going to talk about and share with you some thoughts about is a very difficult and very tough risk to the Colombian democracy, that is the systematic killing of social leaders and defenders or advocates of human rights. As I must say, for the sake of clarity, that this approach, or what I am going to present to you today, has basically two sources. The first one is, of course, my ethnographic experience in working for almost 2 long years with this organization, and the other is some reports of human rights organizations in Colombia that are monitoring and that are reporting, the statistics about the frequency of this systematic assassination of leaders. So basically what I'm presenting are some thoughts about this current trend of killings in Colombia that has the paradox that, as many of we are in the middle of a peace process. But however, the paradox is that these killings are not only continuing, but there is a tendency that they are increasing in number. So basically what I want, the presentation is divided into 3 main parts. The first one, I want to share with you some, the context that is, determining the highly risky profession of defenders of human rights and social leaders. And with this, I want to set out some ideas that come from my participation in the organizations of human rights and during all these years. The second part, I will delve in some reports, especially one of In the Past, that is one of the most important human rights organizations that is monitoring all the statistics of death harassments, death threats, all these violent practices that human rights are subject of, not only before the peace agreement, but during the peace agreement that was signed between the Colombian state in head of Juan Manuel Santos, President Juan Manuel Santos, and the FARC guerrillas back in 2016. So basically, I'm going to show who are these social leaders, who are these human rights defenders in the second part, and in the third one, and that I will end the presentation, I will suggest some new paths or some new expressions of a new cycle of violence. A new cycle of violence that is, targeted to, or aimed to paralyze organizative process of communities of base. So basically, the organizations of human rights, back in 2000, in the period of 2016 until mid-2018, the organizations of human rights were relatively moderately optimist, in the sense that, the peace agreement was a very important political opportunity window that was opened, and that for the first time in Colombian history, the victims had a chance of being visible and to, elevate their voices and grievances. In the previous peace processes that Colombian society has engaged in, basically, for example, the one signed back in the 90s with the M19 guerrilla and with the EPL guerrilla, the victims didn't appear and the victims were not part of the negotiations. Back in the in the government of Uribe, there was a demobilization process of paramilitary forces, but victims were not necessarily in the core center of the agreement. The fact is that with this, with the process signed by Juan Manuel Santos and the FARC guerrillas back in 2016, the victims became a central part of the agreement. Basically, almost all the agreement started to gravitate around, the reivindicative processes of the people who have been victimized by armed actors during this 60 years long armed conflict. So as you can imagine, the atmosphere that we were experiencing in the last years of 2017 and the first years of 2018 was one of a moderate optimism. The victims, some of the victims with whom I work with, and some of the leaders with whom I work with, had the chance to go to the Havana, and to tell their story, their testimonies, and everything. So it was an interesting moment for the advocacy of human rights. It was a very strong political opportunity, and the organizations were acting in that direction. However, I say it is moderate because the victims had, or we Colombians had this experience that even though the peace agreement was signed, 1 month later, back in October, I guess it was, or in November, no, in October of 2016, because Juan Manuel Santos promised that the agreement was going to be validated by the Colombian society. We went to an election, a referendum, that was deciding basically if people supported peace or if they didn't support peace. And unfortunately, the election Juan Manuel Santos, the election was won by the contradictories of the peace process, and that was the first obstacle that the organizations of victims had. So that's why there's some sort of moderate optimism, because they were aware that things were going to be extremely difficult. And the first signal was, of course, the defeat of the referendum supporting peace. But despite this, the years between 2017 and 2018, the mid 2018, were one of a special creativity for social organizations. They were, rebuilding alliances between them. There was a very nice scenario to travel to regions to document cases of human rights violations. I had the chance to go to several regions in Colombia with the Media Erica Foundation. And, there was this environment that actually we were experiencing some sort of peace, people, I mean, there was this, illusion or this hope that for the first time in Colombian history, they were going to be here, that the Colombian society, that is the segments of the Colombian population that are, distance from the regions that where the conflict is especially heated, will have for the first time will have the chance to meet the victims that have historically been invisible for a large segment of the Colombian population. In fact, so this is like an ethnographic vignette that I wanted to share with you. In the first year in my first year as a professor at the National University, the Universidad Nacional, that was in 2019, that at that point the optimism, of course, was already decreasing. I had this amazing experience of having in the same course, in the same round table, in the same classroom, direct victims of political violence, students who were victimized, who in some cases their parents were killed by armed actors, or they were displaced from their places of origin, and in the same table with ex-combatants of FARC guerrillas. So these were people who 20, 15 years ago decided to go to join the FARC, and they, because of the peace process, they came back and, to finish their careers. And we have these very special moments where, of course, because you can imagine the sessions were very emotionally loaded, but it was like a small vision or a small case of what in the general society was happening. And of course, very interesting things happen that we can go in a deeper way afterwards. But in general terms, the peace process that, one of the points of the peace process was the implementation of a transitional justice system, that you have the Commission of Truth, you have the JEP, that is the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, that in Spanish is Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz, and the unity of search of people that are disappeared, la unidad de búsqueda de personas dadas por desaparecidas. Those were the contexts and, the targets of the organizations of human rights, and that's where I came, to help and to work with them in writing the reports for these three different institutions. So from 2017 to mid 2018, we were projecting and we were predicting that there was going to be a whole, and a massive expression of, all the organizations were going to write their reports and everything, and we were expecting also to have lots of aesthetic and expressive manifestations of, the experiences of the war, but things started to decrease, in this optimistic way of seeing things, and basically because the people who were opposing to the peace process from the beginning became won the presidential elections back in 2018, and President Ivan Duque arrived to the presidency. The thing is that of course, the human rights organizations were predicting that things were going to be bad with this new government, and in fact it is, but they didn't. I think that things are getting worse when compared with what they were expecting that was going to happen. And in part because there is a systematic campaign to weaken all the transitional institutions. So, what was where the victims were the center, and we were working all together with amazing processes, even the social organizations of human rights became powerful sites of formation of new activists. That's something that I tackled in my dissertation. These things started, to get a little fuzzy, and things became more difficult, as you that are living in the United States, that you are basically also experiencing something similar as what we are experiencing in Colombia, that is the radicalization of the people, of the right-wing political parties. The expression of this radicalization in the Colombian context has to do, or has a direct impact on the peace process, on the things that were agreed. So that's, from a moderate optimism, we are now entering deep aspects of, skepticism, even, hopelessness. Another issue that characterizes today, context in the defense of the Colombian context, the defense of human rights, is the political mobilization that is taking place in Colombia. Last year, back in November of last year, we participated, I guess the people who were living there, with an amazing mobilization processes, and basically the citizens take up the streets, with a very heterogeneous range of claims and grievances and demands against the government of Presidente Ivan Duque. This is a process that is not exclusively Colombian, comes from, of course, from Chile. And basically, one of the most important points is of these people, in the street protesting, that are trying to make, is that the welfare state, the Colombian welfare state, is weakening deliberately. And there is a correlation between welfare state and the correct implementation of the peace process. So not only there is a radicalization against the peace process, from a political perspective, but there is also a dismantling of the welfare state in terms of public education, public health, these kinds of rights that are also, pushing people to go out to the streets. So basically, the social unrest that we are experiencing, and actually tomorrow there is a huge national strike lots of people have arrived to Bogota, you know, with all the uncertainties that a protest in the middle of a pandemic implies. But there is a huge movement right now that has to do with people asking for the correct implementation of the agreements that are, according to the Kroc Institute of the University of Notre Dame, is around 6% until now, only just 6%. So it's basically that they haven't implemented mostly anything. You know, and if afterwards, if you want, we can go to some aspects of the agreement that are implemented in this point. So basically, the Colombian government has a double standard, has a double discourse for foreign policy purposes. The government is implementing the agreement such as it was signed, but within borders, the thing is getting pretty ugly for human rights advocates and human rights and social leaders. In fact, the systematic killings of social leaders and human rights defenders is still an ongoing process. And with some nuances, we can say that it has been a never-stopping process. Okay, so who are these people? Who are the social leaders and who are the human rights defenders and who is killing them? First of all, you know, when in some of my field trips, I spent time talking with several leaders, you know, and here with leaders, social leaders and human rights defender, I am including both men and women, you know, who mentioned that social leaders and human rights defenders were the ethical reserves of Colombian society. You know, that these people who have struggling, who have in their body the burden of atrocious violence, who have experienced the destruction of their communities, who have experienced the cruelty of the Colombian violence, are in fact their ethical reserves. So what happened, and actually I agree with that statement, what happened when in the midst of a peace process, there are still killing the ethical reserves of the armed conflict? So according to several reports of human rights, the social leaders and the defenders of human rights can be defined in this way. The leader is multifunctional, is the voice of the communities, especially in those areas absent from where the state is absent, but is also the one who watches over the fulfillment of human rights, promotes development, defends the environment, also defends the substitution, the voluntary substitution of illegal crops. That is all the part that is related to the drug trade. And encourage effective participation of citizens and are builders of peace and of the social fabric. They fight against illegal economies, carry out citizens, try to extend citizenship, and most of the times, if not always, they are grassroots. Their origin is from grassroots areas. Another social leader identifies social leaders and human rights defenders as the soul of the territories. They are the beacon of their communities. They are the source of democracy. They are the germ of ancestral knowledge. They are part of the umbilical cord that connects to the earth, and they are the hope for peace. So in general terms, these the social leaders and the defenders of human rights, and they in Colombia they use this as if they were different, but the organizations of human rights have improved their classificatory systems, and they are actually saying that a social leader is a defender or an advocate of human rights. So basically are the same. But the problem is, or the question is, what happened when one social leader is killed? Of course, you have the, family drama, the family tragedy, and everything that comes with an homicide or a massacre, whatever you wanted to put it. But with the murdering or assassination of a social leader, you end a historic process of organization. You kill a deep process of knowledge and diagnostics of what is going on terrain regarding violence and regarding, of course, resilience and resistance and all these kinds of things. So the killing of a social leader, of one social leader, has a collective impact. A collective impact that tends to paralyze, the organizative processes that, peasants, indigenous people, well, we'll see right afterwards some graphics, but basically is the eradication of memory that has to do with what I was telling you beforehand, that was the point of the social leaders as the ethical preserves of society. No? So that's the drama. So here I want to present, this is from the last report of In the Past. If you see this graph, this graph shows the rate of or numbers of homicides of human rights defenders since the agreement, since the signature of the agreement. So you have that in the 2 months of after the agreement was signed, 21 people were killed. In 2017, 208 people were killed, and in 2018, 298. So if you remember that I was telling that, the year 2017 and 2018 was one of a moderate optimism. This moderate optimism was due also because we or the social organizations and the Organization of Human Rights were perfectly aware that the systematic persecution, the systematic assassination of grassroots leaders were still an ongoing process. An ongoing process that, as you can see, in 2020, we have now 166 social leaders, that without including the rate of ex-combatants that have been killed until now, that as far as I'm concerned, is around 233 ex-combatants have been assassinated, people who signed the agreement. So that's a very complex point. Here in this chart, in this table, we can see it, I think, better. So this is the rate of, this is from in the past also, the rate of assassinations by department. or Colombian state, if you want to put it that way. If you see, I forgot here to put the years, but this is the total. This is 2020, 2019, 2018, 2017. So if you check it, the Department of Cauca is the one who is the region which has more deaths of social leaders, followed by Antioquia. That has to do with the problem of land ownership. That, as I will describe it soon. So here is, of course, there is a prevalence of social leaders that are the heart of the communities, that are, that the communities believe in them, that they gave them all the legitimacy, of the struggle, and, and they're the depositaries of a deep collective knowledge, of course, are more vulnerable in rural areas, rather than in urban or citizen or in cities. So this is the distribution per month, in 2020 until July. No, that's a very important thing. So we haven't included, but it's going to happen. So if we go back, if we have this data, and if we have 166 deaths until July, it is perfectly possible that this trend, will remain constant. So we are talking about around 500, around 300 people dead by this kind of systematic engagement. So here is, I think, the most important chart that in the past this organization presents to us. So how is distributed by sectors? If you see here, the people who are persecuted the most are peasants and indigenous people, followed by civic leadership that is related to political grassroots participation, or communitarian or communal type of organization. But the interesting things of social leadership and defenders of human rights right now is that even though this is an effort of the organizations to classify, the population that is being killed right now, you can perfectly find that the indigenous can be also self-identify as peasants and at the same time be part of an union, or at the same time be part of a civic association, etc. And what is surprisingly increasing also is this last point of diversity, that are leaders that are advocating for rights of LGBT demands. So for example, at this point, so how can I put this? Let me check. So look, here we have also people who are, struggling for environmental protection of territories, but they can also be indigenous people. So if you look at like if you have an overall perspective, you have that the discourse of human rights is functioning now like an umbrella that allows people to use it, advocating for different sectors or different interests. Now, the question, of course, is who is killing them? But before I answer that question, I want to show you this amazing chart, I mean, outrageous chart and quite frightening chart. And is that in 2020, so this year, we have the reappearance or the resurgence of the problems of one of the most critical or most devastating violent practice that are massacres. Now, which, by the way, we had a massacre last month in Bogota after, you know, I don't know if you are aware, but in Bogota we had this case of extreme police brutality where one middle-class lawyer was, you know, hanging out in the street, was caught, I think it was drinking or something in the street, and he was beat up until, you know, by police, who finally killed him, which was a similar scenario of what happened in the US with the case of Mr. George Floyd. So after that exposition of police brutality, which was basically filmed and everybody almost watched it, just as in the case in the US. After that, lots of people started to take the streets back, and the police responded with extreme violence, killing, deliberately shooting people, almost 13 young people. So that makes that you know that the fact that, you know, that the government, the current government, is defunding the institutions, the transitional institutions, you know, in this thesis that I am exposing, that is a radicalization of their negationism. You know, they're defunding the Commission of, they defunded the Commission on Truth by 40%. So they have, the Commission on Truth has 40% less human resources, less chances to, you know, travel throughout the territory to capture testimonies, etc. So we can say that we have 40% less of truth. And yesterday they announced that they are going to defund the HIP by 30%. So they're basically converting these institutions in institutions without teeth, no? And that is related, of course, with the increase of the repression tactics of the state. So let me show you another graph that I have it here about who are killing these social leaders and who are the responsibles.
Sebastian, so you were talking about the breakdown of who were the people who are being killed by by group, and you did note that you had indigenous people and peasants, you know, as the highest numbers, but then you had civic, and then the question was, is there any overlap in these categories? You know, so the civic leaders are classified differently than indigenous local leaders and peasant local leaders, right?
Yes, Manuel, that's a very good question, you know, and it's very possible that that there is not necessarily an overlapping in the registration of cases of human rights violations, but in their practices, you know, they navigate all those scenarios. You know, so you can perfectly be an indigenous NASA person from the Northern Cauca, but also self-identify in another scenario as peasant and be part of an union. You know, it's part of what is going on terrain, on the ground, you know, especially thinking about political association, a political organizing. But you know, when this data is you know obtained, you know, there is clearly an identification just with only one. That's what I wanted to tell you, because this, you know, it's very interesting, this process of innovation of the, you know, organizations of human rights when exactly dealing with this kind of information. No, so they're improving their classification systems to make them more accurate. So I'm going to, yes.
And so I also had a question. I mean, not to get into the more gruesome and graphic aspects of this, but are the methods that are being utilized to exterminate or to go after people working on behalf of the peace process, are the methods similar, or are we talking about, you know, just whatever random opportunity?
So I'm going to ask you that. I'm going to answer that question, Manuel, with this chart. So I'm going to again share. So, you know, in 2019, the 63% of the presumptive responsible of these crimes were considered unknown or by, you know, this Sicario logic, you know. 17% is associated with narco-paramilitary structures, and 11% is associated with dissidences of FARC. 5% is associated with ELN, and the 4% is associated with the public force.
But perhaps now is a good time, while you're trying to get that up, to see if anybody else has a question or comment.
Yes, hi everyone. Hi, I have a question, actually, a couple of questions, if it's possible. Hi, Sebastian. Nice to meet you. And congratulations for your work. So I have, could you say something on what's your impression on the role of journalism and media on this crisis? And the other question is, it seems to me like your project deals with memory. And I'm curious, and this is not like one of those, I want to catch you with this question, but I'm actually doing something on memory, trying to frame an article that I'm writing. And it's just for, I'm curious if you are dealing with memory in your dissertation, and what kind of theories, or what kind of what do you recommend for dealing with memory, especially for this specific case? Thank you.
No, thank you for your questions, Diego. No, of course, journalism has to do, I mean, is in the core of this, you know, process of knowing things, what's going on the ground. And especially, you know, even because of the pandemics, the social organizations of human rights, the association of victims, that say that there's a whole bunch of you know, relationships between associations, organizations. Some are much bigger, some are really small, but they have using very effectively the social redes, the social media. You know, if I am obsessively following almost all organizations of victims that have a Twitter, for example, and they are being very effective effective in denouncing, on almost on live cases of homicides of social leaders. No, so that's interesting. And of course, if you want to check about memory, you can. If you are interested in memory, you can check all the absolutely extraordinary work of the National Center of National Memory of Colombia. They have almost like 80 or 100, cases of emblematic cases where they are trying to tell, with the most accuracy possible what happened. So if you are interested in the Colombian case, you can check those studies. I don't know why I can't share, Manuel. I am worried.
Well, I think that you gave us a general idea of how they're distributed, though, and I think that we can use that to complement, and while you keep on going at it. There was something else that that you were talking about earlier in terms of the effect that disappearing or making somebody or so anyway, I guess it's somewhat related to what Diego was going after, but what has the effect been in terms of recruitment for work in these organizations, for the initiatives? Has there been, has the all this systematic extermination process quelled the impetus of people trying to do this work? Is it becoming fewer and far between? Are these organizations falling apart? What has that been like?
Well, Manuel, that's a very interesting question. And as I mentioned in the introduction of this talk, part of my fieldwork in Colombia is to, ask or interrogate the different processes of knowledge production of social movements, specifically the movements of victims and human rights. So, because of the transition, the discourse of memory, and with this I can also answer to Diego, became, very interesting for students, for example, who were sensitive to these kinds of topics. So it was also a time where, it was a moment that for the first time, social organizations had the chance to connect with and to build links with people that do not necessarily were close enough in terms of their struggle. So when I arrived to the foundation, for example, with me, after me, they arrived like 25 students. So it was a very interesting, case where we all learned what social, human rights meant, what everything was all about. We came to know, untearing all the logics of violence and at the same time, all the logics of resilience and resistance. And it was, a very interesting formative site for people that have experienced the conflict from, the barrier or the bubble, and, start exchanging emotions, and by those exchanges, forming as some sort of, activist on the defense of human rights. But of course, all this that was, this period of moderate optimism that I was describing at the beginning, that, for example, the discourse of memory, the discourse of resistance, of victims, of collectivities, of associations, was, present everywhere. So that also, enabled people to connect with all these topics that were, as I mentioned also before, absolutely invisible for most part of the Colombian population, because victims have been invisible. So let me discuss this briefly, Manuel and colleagues. And, in Spanish, I'm sorry, but these are this table is very powerful from my perspective, because shows what we can what we can begin to experience, that is a new cycle of violence. So this, when 62% in 2017 and increasing from 1% and maybe increasing for 2020 even more, nobody knows who kills social leaders. Nobody knows who kills these hearts of the community, these people who embody the collective knowledge and collective memory of certain regions or collectivities. Nobody knows. When I was writing the reports for the Commission of Truth of several regions, Manuel and colleagues, the perpetrators were known. From the period that goes from from the last years of 1990 to the first 5 or 7 years of 2000, victims knew who were the ones who killed or disappeared or displaced them. They knew their names. They knew that they were part of this paramilitary bloc. They knew that they were part of this guerrilla front, etc. But now the things are getting a little messy, because the practices of violence have been, improved. In terms of the perpetrators, and designed just for one purpose, and it's not, and it's for not letting evidence. So nobody is and that has to do, with with the increased banality of the people who are connected with the drug trade, for example. So basically, this, when you don't have a responsible, that is of course very functional to the system, that in the first place victimized all these people, in terms of landowners, according to, for example, Oxfam, the last report of Oxfam. For example, when dealing with peasants, 86% of the usable land of Colombia, the fertile land, the usable, is concentrated in 1% of the population. In another another statistic said or mentioned that 75% of the usable land is concentrated in the 25% of the population. There's, of course, a huge variance there, but what is undeniable is that with these unknown perpetrators, the concentration of land is, tending to concentrate even more, So those are, because if you take, for example, the case of the narco paramilitaries, that are, these the same old paramilitaries, that were supposed to be demobilizing in the Uribe's government, but they're the same structure, but with different name. But this unknown, is what is really striking today. As I mentioned in the report that with my team, we wrote around 120 life histories and several subnational contexts of violence. And in most cases, we knew And because we had this information in the legal archives, you know, of each of the case, we knew, and we interviewed the people, I mean, the victims and everything, and we could, you know, construct this context, this scenario. But with when you don't have, when you have faceless perpetrators, things get really messy, because, you know, there is no way to, you know, to demand for justice. How do you demand justice or reparations when you don't know? And the tendency is that one. And of course, the objective of that, of these sicarios and these unknown people, is basically to break down the confidence of the collectivities, to break down, you know, the strength, the processes of political association, and of course, all those knowledges that are built through time. So I don't know if you have more questions.
Yeah, we have one question from Camilo.
So I know, I read the news every day, and the thing is so dramatic and so sad, and it seems like there is no hope, right? But I just had a question. Are there like some organizations that are, or areas in the country, or people in the country that are managing to contain this like systematic killing somehow?
No, Camilo. I mean, from an institutional standpoint, the Commission of Truth is, you know, is helping to visibilize this systematic persecution. But no, I mean, the only you know, backup or support that this organization have are the same organizations. You know, the possibility that they are, you know, joined, that they are allied, that they are in permanent exchanges, and that's possible, and it has been, and it's proof that it works, and it's all the part of social media. You know, Twitter, for example, is a very used strategy, you know, for denouncing threats, because you know how the modus operandi is. First, in the most cases you have first a threat that comes with a pamphlet or with a face-to-face and everything, and then comes, you know, the assassination. And there are institutions that are, you know, thought to protect, I mean, national state institutions to protect these kinds of things, that is called the program of alertas tempranas, of early, you know, alerts, that, you know, because of the radicalization of this government, Camilo, how is it called? The Defensoría del Pueblo, no, is now run by a very right-wing guy that is dismantling this system of early alerts. So there are basically I mean, in other words, they have, nobody protects them. Just they are protecting by themselves and by, you know, the unity of their human rights organizations.
Okay. And Sebastian, thank you very much. And just really briefly, because I know that lots of, you know, some of the people are probably just thinking, okay, we've gone over a bit, but just one question. As the COVID pandemic and the situation with the people staying at home, has this made things worse, or, you know, kept some people from being killed, or is it just making it easier?
Well, Manuel, the thing with the COVID is that it has increased the structural, you know, conditions of peasants. I mean, structural, really precarious conditions of peasants, indigenous people, and overall grassroots or community-based organizations because they haven't been able to work or because they lost their job, or I mean, the pandemic has revealed, the structural violence that the Colombian society has imposed over these historical populations. But that not necessarily has stopped perpetrators to kill social leaders. So the tendency remains constant with the, with the complex situation that the COVID has unmasked again, the precarious structural conditions of these populations. So they don't only have now the risk of, perpetrators, but they have, the risk of being contagious or to getting the COVID by, going to work when the government should supply for them also. No.
So for now, I want to thank everybody who took part in this event. It is, as I said before, our first in a series that we are calling Crimes Against Humanity in Latin America. I just want to thank Sebastian once again for his time, for his patient delivery, and all of you for taking part in this first in a series. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Manuela. Thank you, everybody.